Computer. Welcome, everybody, to Boston 9/11 Truth. Today is January 8th, 2026. So today we have a very special speaker, which I'm very grateful he's able to join us. I'm trying to get at my notes and my computer isn't quite working right. There we go. Okay. So before we begin, just a quick disclaimer. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the speaker's own and do not necessarily represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of the Boston 9/11 Truth. The material and information presented here is for general information and educational purposes only. The Boston 9/11 Truth and all its forms and abbreviations are the property of its owners, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. Boston 9/11 Truth aims to inspire and promote action by truth advocates who support them and their efforts. So during our meeting, we have a brief synopsis of our guidelines. I'm sure you all saw that the guidelines and have seen them in the past. Participants, please abide by our guidelines during the entire meeting. All participants are to use polite decorum and are expected to be respectful of all other participants. No personal attacks are allowed. Of course, disagreement and debate are allowable as long as the content, not the person, is confronted. Voice is kept at a speaking level of sound, no shouting, and no one interrupts another person. So the first part of our meeting is our guest speaker's presentation, Richard. The presentation is to be presented in full without interruption. We are all to treat the speaker with respect, even and especially if there is disagreement. So at the end of his presentation, you can raise your hand and ask a question or make a brief comment. Questions and comments will be limited to 2 minutes and must be pertinent to the presentation. So without further ado, Richard Ellefritz is our guest speaker. He will give a recap of his recent presentation and discuss his overall research, and then take part in a discussion afterwards. However, he has done some amendments on his presentation, which we will see tonight. He expresses that there is cause for optimism in light of the increase of people questioning official stories over the years. Richard G. Ellefritz is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of the Bahamas. He earned his Ph.D. in sociology at Oklahoma State University after successfully defending his dissertation on the conspiracy as used to avoid offering direct and rigorous rebuttals to empirical claims made by so-called conspiracy theorists. So welcome, Richard.
Okay, thank you for that introduction and for welcoming to your group and teleconference here. I think you laid out pretty much what everybody can expect. I'll say that on December 14th, I gave the third annual David Ray Griffin lecture invited by IC 9/11, Ted Walter, and Piers Robinson. And there are parts of that presentation in what I'm going to present tonight, and one reason for this is because since that is available online at ic911.org, I thought I would try to engage in a value-added approach and offer something that um, nobody has seen before in its entirety. So there are bits and pieces from previous presentations I've given over the years since I started studying the 9/11 truth movement during my PhD program in 2010. So I was, oh, 24 or 5 years old at the time, and I had to seek administrative approval from various members of the hierarchy of the university at Oklahoma State. Eventually, I was given approval, and I had a very good mentor and advisor during that time, and eventually successfully defended my doctoral dissertation, in which I think I rigorously defended a thesis that David Ray Griffin laid out in his paper and presentation called "Let's Get Empirical," which is that this conspiracy theorist label is essentially used so that people can ridicule, stigmatize, and ultimately silence people who raise disturbing questions of historically significant events. And later on, Lance DeHaven Smith codified this in his book, Conspiracy Theories in America. And he was kind enough to, in part, coach me way through my doctoral research. So that's a little bit of the background, and I'll go ahead and get started. This is an unrehearsed presentation, so we'll give that caveat. I was just putting together last minute, trying to deal with some technical issues. This is also an extension of the presentation that I recently gave for another group just last night, in fact. So again, I want to take a value-added approach and offer some material that people have not necessarily seen in its entirety. So that being said, without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. Let me take care of some of the technical issues with Zoom. Okay, so I decided to title this talk a very general, kind of generic title, A Sociological Look at the 9/11 Truth Movement, which leaves open some room for interpretation and analysis. I always like to give credit where credit is due, and which I think Laura Jones deserves quite a bit of credit. She's a geographer. In 2010, published this article, How Do the American People Know? Embodying Post 9/11 Conspiracy Discourse. So this is the title page. It's open online. You can find it online. Apparently 2009. I thought it was 2010. Interestingly enough, like one of the points she makes is that while people like Zbigniew Brzezinski are allowed to engage in what's essentially conspiracy discourse, in his book, The Grand Chessboard, he essentially says, we can't achieve our goals of American supremacy around the world unless there's some catalyzing event, which is very similar to the infamous statement in the Project for a New American Century document, Rebuilding America's Defenses, in which they said they needed something like a new Pearl Harbor. And then in her article, she compares Luke Rudkowski, at the time 21-year-old Luke Rudkowski of We Are Change, and how he's ridiculed and stigmatized for essentially calling out Brzezinski on his proposal to manipulate the American public. So in that article, which is one of the first peer-reviewed studies on the 9/11 truth movement, which offers a definition which, for scholarly purposes, academic purposes, I think stands the test of time. I have some criticisms of it, which might be a little pedantic, in which he says the 9/11 truth movement is the umbrella term for a coalition of individuals based both in the US and abroad. I'll stop right there and say that during my first field expedition in Manhattan on September 11, 2001, I interviewed one gentleman who had flown in all the way from East Asia, and now I'm forgetting what country, I think it's Vietnam. He told me that he read a couple of David Ray Griffin's books, and he took it upon himself to fly all the way across the world to join the activists that day. So these are people all around the world who promote the belief. Now, like, who promote the belief? Well, with evidence is what I would say, but that the US government was to some degree involved in orchestrating the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. I might amend that by saying the events of September 11th, 2001. But we could talk about the fact that there were terrorists who did engage in some form of destructive, murderous behavior. And that was in order to justify subsequent courses of action, including the Iraq War and curtailing of civil liberties in the United States. So, again, I think generally speaking, it's a fairly good definition of the 9/11 truth movement. This is from her article, and this is something that I've seen, and I know some of the people joining us today have been at what's called Ground Zero or on sites of activism in Manhattan on September 11th during the anniversaries or memorials. This is something I've seen myself, so I believe these are my photographs of 2013 during the, I think, Rethink 9/11 campaign. At the time, I thought it was organized by Mike Figa, but I recently found out that Ted Walters had some involvement in that as well. Now, the 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 claims about like World Trade Center 7, the third building that collapsed on September 11th, um, are a primary focus of my research. It's not the only event that occurred that is important or anomalous to the official story, but in terms of a social movement, like this not only means that the official story was a lie, because there was foreknowledge that World Trade Center Building 7 was going to collapse. It collapsed at free fall acceleration, which was a point that had to be forced upon NIST to be admitted. And then NIST said that normal office fires were a new phenomenon that led to progressive collapse. So, how could foreknowledge and a new phenomenon coexist in reality? This seems like a contradiction. But this also means for the 9/11 truth movement that it's a form of patriotism, that it's patriotic dissent to question government, to question authority. And it's not coming from a place of anti-authoritarianism. It's coming from a place largely from empiricism, from the observation of empirical evidence that is contradictory to the official story of the events of September 11th, 2001. And through this active pursuit of truth and justice is a key component as well, because it's not just about truth, it's about the consequences for the true perpetrators. Uh, Members of the 9/11 truth movement experience routinely, I would say, ridicule from the public at large. Now, this is a part of a well-known um, counter movement strategy or set of tactics that's spelled out by a feminist scholar, Mira Marx Fury, in her book chapter on soft repression, ridicule, stigma, and silencing, in which she was analyzing feminist movements and how these feminist movements, in various regards, would experience interpersonal ridicule, general social stigma, and then silencing more broadly to keep their voices out of the mainstream. So, soft repression can be compared to hard repression experienced, for example, by members of the civil rights movement, who were coalitions of individuals across the United States who were opposed to the social order, largely of the southern United States, the southeastern United States at the time, of racial segregation. So, what the civil rights movement were doing was street demonstrations and protests, or what academically are called repertoires of contention. So, holding signs, pickets, demonstrations, boycotts, sit ins, things like that, marches. And part of the point is to gain media recognition, to spread the word. And this is important because you need other people to be informed, be educated, and eventually, hopefully, join or support your efforts. So there are notable figures, and notably, I think a parallel between the 9/11 truth movement and the civil rights movement were the COINTEL programs of the FBI, who many people, I think, legitimately suspect were involved in the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Doctor. Uh, as a key figure, you know, you could focus on leaders or factions because certainly there was the Malcolm X wing and other factions of the civil rights movement. I think there are important parallels there as well. But I want to key us into disobedience because one of the things that MLK was doing was organizing mass disobedience, in which there was hard repression as well as soft repression. And so this is a well-known historical photo, I believe, of a dock worker who refused to participate in the mass collective behavior of obedience to authority of the Third Reich in Nazi Germany, in which they organized the masses in such a way that later a psychologist, Stanley Milgram, wanted to understand how was it that a civilized society like Germany could be organized in such a way to support a regime like the National Socialist Party of Germany. And his famous study, which I'll get to in a second, is interesting, but he also had a lot of wisdom. There was a reason why he engaged in that study. And there's also a reason why educators like myself routinely teach students about Stanley Milgram's study. And this sociological wisdom, I think, is just underlying some of the assumptions that I bring in my analysis when he says it's not so much the kind of person a man is as the kind of situation in which he finds himself that determines how he will act. So if culture, social institutions, and organizations are structured in a way that lead to mass or collective behavior that can be influenced or controlled, then the ruling establishment can essentially direct society in a way that benefits its interests, its goals, and motivations. So, what his study was an experiment in which one subject of the experiment was convinced that they were taking part in a randomized study. So they were either the teacher or the learner, but the subject was always the teacher. The quote unquote learner, the student, was a participant of the experimental study. And so these people were convinced that they were shocking an actual human being with increasing levels of electrocution that eventually would lead to severe injury and death. And something like two-thirds to three-quarters of the people would obey authority to the point where they would administer either a lethal or a injurious amount of shock. This is what they believe. They never were actually shocking an individual, but this shows that people will obey authority to the point where they will harm or kill another human being. He said, it may be that we are puppets, puppets controlled by the strings of society, but at least we are puppets with perception, with awareness. And perhaps our awareness is the first step to our liberation. That if people can be made known that they are able to be controlled, that they can recognize the control over themselves. But it's more complicated than that. There's another experiment done by Solomon Asch that's very famous, and we teach this for very similar purposes. In his study, there were a group of participants who were participating with the experimentalists. There was one subject, and the point was to get the subject to agree with the Confederates based upon an observable distortion of reality. So the question would be, which line does the line on the left here best fit? Is it line A, B, or C? And you can see that it lines up with C. All of the stooges would say either A or B, which is observably false. And over time, the person would conform to the peer pressure of the group around them. So even our perceptions can be manipulated in group situations. So if you can control mass society, you can control people who will potentially disobey authority. Now, there's an important book that recently came out by the well-known psychologist and public intellectual Steven Pinker. And this snippet here is by Jonathan Haidt, who's a well-known social psychologist. In the book, When Everyone Knows, Pinker lays out essentially the idea that when everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows, we can overcome what's called pluralistic ignorance. So there are three levels to this. When everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows, We all share common knowledge of a social reality. And I believe that one of the efforts that is being made by the 9/11 Truth Movement is to bring public awareness that everybody knows, that everybody knows, that everybody knows. For example, World Trade Center 7 building collapsed not due to fires, which is the official story, but due to something else. Now, what that something else is up to the architects, engineers, and other uh, scientists and analysts who do those types of empirical studies. As a sociologist, my concern is a little bit different. So, coming back to Faree's book chapter on soft repression, ridicule, stigma, and silencing, my questions from a sociological point of view are more about how this works societally. So, what are these discursive obstructions that occur in multi-institutional contexts? So, institutions are like family, religion, education, media, government, economy, and organizations are like schools, churches, hospitals, MSNBC, Fox News, NPR, and things like that. So we have different levels of analysis, like the micro, meso, and macro. So ridicule occurs interpersonally. That's where you will be called a conspiracy theorist or a truther. Stigma is that conspiracy theorists or truthers are irrational, potentially dangerous, unhinged, paranoid, epistemologically flawed, uh, irrational, kooks who don't know what they're talking about. So anybody who seems like they could be a conspiracy theorist are open to interpersonal ridicule. And then silencing occurs at the macro level where you never entertain or discuss what these people say in mass media or allow it on social media. The most recent example, well, not the most recent example, but a pertinent recent example would be how social media silenced the Hunter Biden laptop story in the 2020 election. And I know that there are more pertinent examples, but that's the one that comes to mind. So how this kind of works is there's generally a stigma against conspiracy theorists. Well, you will see these tropes. This is a social media content creator who goes by the name Uniballer, and I reached out to him, and the reason he goes by that name is because he had testicular cancer. Now, I became interested in this because he was performing this character that needs no explanation. You don't need to be told who he's playing here. He's this kind of, eccentric, irrational conspiracy theorist who's connecting the dots between things that, the normal person wouldn't connect. And he was doing this in what he called the Sandler verse, like how all of the different Adam Sandler movies, like Pixels, connect to the different Adam Sandler movies. In that movie Pixels, there's a character named Ledlow. Ledlow is the conspiracy theorist trope of the eccentric basement dweller who has all of these photos across his wall, like was JFK cloned or things about extraterrestrials and stuff like that. And the audience doesn't need to be told anything more than what they're shown because there's generally a stigma in society at the cultural level. So there has been a book about this called The Stigmatization of Conspiracy Theory since the 1950s. And uh, the subtitle being a quote, a plot to make us look foolish. And that's in quotes because essentially the author is analyzing the rise of the stigmatization of conspiracy theories at the cultural level, but ends up denying that there's been any type of concerted action or plot. Well, there's a document released by, or a FOIA request that was generated by a CIA chief, and it's CIA memo 1035-960. And this was released to other CIA stations, and it essentially mapped out how it was that CIA was to correspond with their assets, likely uh, in the Project Mockingbird, in which CIA had assets in media, and it mapped out how it is that they were to refute the growing skepticism of the Warren Commission's findings of the JFK assassination. So they said that, well, okay, here's what these skeptics do is they're wedded to a theory and they generally ignore new findings and things like that. So if I could back out of that, I'll show you that I have an article, and this is the summary conclusion on propaganda and focus. This is one in a series of articles that I wrote. This is the third of four in which I analyzed that memo and its connection to the broader psychological literature on conspiracy theories that stigmatizes uh, conspiracy theories. So these are the four articles that I show are directly connected back to that CIA memo. So I'll make this available to the group, but you can go to Propaganda and Focus and search my name. But essentially, there was a person, Tom Bethel, whose article, editorial in a regional outlet in the Northwest, basically follows CIA memo 1035-960. It,
Richard, your presentation isn't moving along from the foyer.
oh, okay. I know what happened. I apologize. What happened is I'm not sharing my screen. Okay. Can you see the web page now?
Yep.
Okay. I apologize. Yeah. So that was a Zoom feature. You have to share the specific thing. So thank you for pointing that out. And if there are any other technical difficulties, please interject. So just real quick, uh, this is the uh, web page that I've been referencing. You can search this out on propagandaandfocus.com and just search my name, and it'll be there with 8 or so other articles. I go through and I think I do a pretty good job showing that there's a direct connection from the CIA memo through Tom Bethel to researchers in a small women's community college on the other side of the continent in the late 70s. Now, how they obtained that article, I have a particular question about because it doesn't seem to me like that should have been something available to researchers um, at that time. Like it would have been very difficult to obtain that, but that's kind of beyond the point. Uh, so this is the article that is the genesis of the psychologization of conspiracy theories. This is by Macaulay and Jacques, who used Tom Bethel's editorial as the hypothesis that uh, big events lead to big conclusions. This is a snippet from Tom Bethel's article where he says the cause doesn't fit the effect. But the fact is, when great power is vested in one man, as in the president of the United States, it's always possible that a small cause can trigger a large effect. So he's refuting uh, skepticism towards the Warren Commission. And then this was used as a hypothesis in the first psychology article. And then later on, psychologists like these people named here use that to publish a peer-reviewed paper. Now, what people can do is they can say, well, psychologists have found that the reason that people have conspiracy theory beliefs is because big events have big causes. And this manifested in Hugh Tobin's article, Big Events Have Big Causes, My Hops, Lie Hops, and the quote, Truth Behind September 11. So you can see that what I think I'm doing is drawing a direct connection between the concerted effort, the intentional effort to stigmatize conspiracy theories generally, which gives people cause to ridicule others interpersonally. Now, some of you might know who this is just by looking at him. And if you do, I want to address that later on in my presentation about tacit knowledge. But this is Cass Sunstein, who wrote an article in 2008, 2009 with Adrian Vermeule. And this is part of the idea that conspiracy theories are a plague or a virus or a pathogen in society, and they need to be cured. And what he proposed infamously, I would say, is that cognitive infiltration of government insiders should be enacted to disrupt conspiracy movements from the inside. And he focused pretty exclusively and particularly on the 9/11 truth movement, even though He's saying conspiracy theories generally. So after a number of proposals that they entertained, such as criminalizing conspiracy theories, they said, well, since we can't do that, what we have to do is use government to infiltrate them from the inside. David Ray Griffin wrote a phenomenally readable, good book called Cognitive Infiltration, which I highly recommend because it's actually quite funny at times. David Ray Griffin had a great sense of humor, in which he basically says, these people are so, uh, they are so well published and smart individuals. They could not have made the sophomoric junior level mistakes that they make throughout their article. So they must have had some esoteric meaning behind it. And that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek analysis. So this idea of causes and cures has been interrogated by a series of researchers. I would highly recommend the work of Lee Basham and Matthew Dentith, especially in the book Taking Conspiracy Theories Seriously. What they're doing in this top article here that you can see says social sciences conspiracy theory panic. Now they want to cure everyone. They're responding to a French article publication. This is the last page of that publication. On the bottom, you can see all of the various social scientists involved in that publication. They said research into the psychological and social factors underlying the adherence to conspiracy theories is only the beginning. In the absence of solid scientific consensus on the question, we believe it necessary to recall that current attempts to remedy the problem will only be an improvisation. So they want a systematic, concerted effort to quote unquote cure conspiracy theories. And I'll point out Karen Douglas, because Karen Douglas is at the top of a hierarchy of psychologists who are demonizing conspiracy theory beliefs. So she was a full professor. She recruited two graduate students, Daniel Jolie and Michael Wood, who have become professors themselves. And these people have a line of research dedicated to identifying the nature of conspiracy theory beliefs. And not just that, but the consequences. So Douglas, Sutton, Jolly, and Wood have an article, The Social, Political, Environmental, and Health-Related Consequences of Conspiracy Theories. Jolly went on to write an updated article shining a spotlight on the dangerous consequences of conspiracy theories. So what they concluded was that there's a litany of dangerous consequences ranging from non-compliance to vaccine policies, to the erosion of trust in social institutions, violence, extremism, and radicalization, to general social prejudice, scapegoating, stigmatization, hostility, and strained relationships, and erosion of public discourse. So they are generating the scientific literature that is demonizing, not just stigmatizing, people that they label conspiracy theorists. So again, I would suggest that you look into the work of Matthew Dentith, Lee Basham, David Cody, Gina Husting, Martin Orr, Curtis Hagen, and Marius Robb, and others, who conclude that actually conspiracy theories can save lives by the thousands or even millions if we would let them. Because conspiracy theorists perform the function of the 11th man. And this was spelled out in a movie called World War Z, in which they said, in an organization, it's often important to have an 11th person whose job it is to be skeptical of the other 10 people who are making decisions, because those people can be susceptible to group pressures, obedience to authority, and groupthink. And it can be very dangerous, such as, allegedly, the Columbia space shuttle explosion. So the causes and cures of conspiracy theories has led to a institution of scientific literature designed to cure conspiracy theories generally. This goes back to Benas and Miller's 2013 article, Inducing Resistance to Conspiracy Theory Propaganda, Testing Inoculation and Meta-Inoculation Strategies. This is updated 2023, 24, 21, 25, with debunking, preventing, pre-bunking, countering misinformation. And it's all designed to prevent people from entertaining conspiracy theories generally. So there is a concerted effort to undermine the 9/11 truth movement, which today exists in a cultural and discursive environment shaped by the efforts of professional researchers who provided opportunities, such as architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, the administrators of the 9/11 Truth Movement Facebook group, the organizers of this movement, who I'm speaking with today, as well as obstructions by the various social scientists all around the world who are attempting to formulate systematic, scientifically based programs to pre-bunk and prevent people from entertaining what they label misinformation. So I have a problem with this book because it doesn't seriously entertain what I think, shown is that actually the CIA did, in fact, institute the popularization of the stigmatization of conspiracy theories. The CIA did not invent the conspiracy theory label, they helped to popularize it. Sociologically, this goes back to a classic book by Irving Goffman on stigma, Notes on Management of a Spoiled Identity. So, various people can be stigmatized for various reasons. And I won't go into that's a whole thing I could spend 2 weeks on. But the fact of the matter is that stigma can be a seriously limiting social behavior because it disallows people to express their point of view in a way that is considered legitimate by other people. And that consideration of legitimacy is important. Now, there's a broader sort of sociological framework that you can see in the books and the framework here: folk devils and moral panics. So how do you create a moral panic against groups? Well, you want to essentially dehumanize them with propaganda, make them seem ridiculous. And what Howard Beckard showed is that, the labeling process leads to outsiders. So you just use labels like truther, conspiracy theorist, that marginalizes people uh, based upon what they say and what you presume that they think. The article in the middle is by Gina Hustine and Martin Orr, whose names I mentioned earlier in connection with Lee Basham and Matthew Dentith. In their article, Dangerous Machinery, Conspiracy Theorists as a Transpersonal Strategy of Exclusion, they show that this label becomes dangerous machinery at the transpersonal level of media and academic discourse, so that broader institutional level, symbolically stripping the claimant of the status of a reasonable interlocutor. So you are not to be taken seriously if, for example, you bring up World Trade Center 7 in polite discourse. In their article, they show that the rise of the use of conspiracy theorists as a transpersonal strategy of exclusion began in the early 80s. That would be 1 year after that initial psychological article that I showed earlier was an extension of Tom Bethel, whose editorial matches that CIA memo. Now, there would have to be deeper analysis to scientifically show that that's the case, because, for example, it could be that the X-Files came out and more people were, discussing in popular culture the overarching narrative of that show, because the overarching narrative entertains some pretty serious, I think, allegations about social order and social society. There were other shows, movies like Will Smith's Enemy of the State, which later, years later, Edward Snowden came out and showed, yes, the United States government not only has these capabilities to surveil you, but they are doing it in things like Project Prism. Mel Gibson came out with a series of movies, and more recently, the guy who played Hawkeye in the Avengers movie, and Tom Cruise came out with a couple of movies showing that, there are programs that are going on that involve the CIA. In Mel Gibson's movie Conspiracy Theory, it kind of teeters across the lines of dismissible versus acceptable, where he's shown ultimately he was right at least about one of his conspiracy theories. So, in the conclusion of their article, Hussein and Orr say that conspiracy theorist reframes the ongoing definition of the situation, allowing an interactant to claim the higher ground or to displace attention from one issue to another, or to prevail in a battle over the meaning of key terms. That's what I defended my dissertation on. I went through my study uh, that I published in my doctoral dissertation in 2014 after a 3 year ethnography with the 9/11 Truth Movement. At the time, if you were friends with me on my Richard G. Ellefritz Facebook page, this is the banner that you would have seen in the background. And that was due to the Institutional Review Board demand that I make it very apparent who I am, what I'm doing, and things of that nature. So at that time, I was a member of Scholars for 9/11 Truth and Justice. I was engaged in online and offline participant observations and interviews with members of the 9/11 Truth Movement. For example, I went to Manhattan 2011, 2013. Then after my dissertation, I went there in 2015. I want to say 17. And then I was in DC, I think in 2018. I get my dates confused. I should know this. Uh, and then I went back in 2019 and 21, I believe. I know I was there in 21 because I helped the 9/11 Truth Action Project conduct a nationally representative survey of, for example, knowledge about the third building that collapsed on September 11th, 2001. Now, what I also analyzed in my dissertation, this was a slide from my dissertation defense, were, for example, the memes that were shared, like this one, conspiracy theorist, nothing more than a derogatory title used to dismiss a critical thinker. And the reason that I put this in my dissertation is because I know that people in the 9/11 Truth Movement are very aware of the dismissive, derogatory function of the conspiracy theorist label. And that was one of my points, is that there are memes out there and groups out there that seek to regularly ridicule and stigmatize people in the 9/11 Truth Movement and conspiracy theorists more generally. So there was a group called 9/11 Truthers Are Crazy that would share these memes all the time. And there was a campaign put out by Remember Building 7 that generally focused on the phrase, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I'm an Air Force pilot, I'm a first responder, I'm a father. And I'll stop right here and say that when I was in Washington, D.C., I helped to disseminate literature on the Bobby McIlvaine Act to members of Congress as part of my participant observation with, I know Andy Steele was there, Peter Ketchum, and if I'm missing any other names, I apologize. Uh, so this campaign is, again, a part of the recognition that the conspiracy theorist slur does perform its function well because it dismisses the individual and their empirical claims, their actual concerns for what it is that's drawing them to question or critically analyze the official story of 9/11. And so drawing this back to the scholarly side of things, like going back to Laura Jones' work, who's really the first person to publish this in a peer-reviewed manner. I think she spelled out pretty well in her first article, which I presented earlier, what the 9/11 Truth Movement is. I have some problems with it. This one is a little bit different. So here she says the 9/11 Truth Movement are a particularly multifaceted example of how conspiracy can be practiced in contemporary society. Again, there are family members, structural engineers, first responders, Air Force pilots, a broad diversity of people ranging from race, gender, class, religion, nationality, professional occupations, expertise who are involved in a concerted effort to raise awareness that there are serious problems with the official story of 9/11. She goes on to say that this movement has developed an online presence that's demonstrated here by this very talk that I'm giving via teleconference and the 9/11 Facebook group, various social media outlets, various websites. uh, incorporating hundreds and thousands of individuals, groups, and websites, discussion forums, listservs, blogs, internet radio channels, which we now call podcasts, downloadable films like Loose Change, and many others now put out by various organizations and individuals like James Corbett, Richard Gage, etc., and online journals like the Journal of 9/11 Truth Studies, through which conspiratorial imaginaries are circulated, debated, and modified. And so I'll stop right there because I want to talk about this idea of what are conspiratorial imaginaries. So this is a technical term. Like when I read this, I know what the author means. Like so I think that this is something that, if I were teaching a class, I would probably have to spend an entire day on this discussing like what does this mean conspiratorial imaginaries? Well, the conspiratorial component refers to 9/11 truth. And you can see here that Laura Jones was kind of skirting what I think would be the uh, academic obligation to maintain integrity by remaining neutral. So using this term conspiratorial, I think, is not neutral. The imaginaries component refers to the movement. So it's not imaginaries as if you have a figment of your imagination. What imaginaries are, in the scholarly sense, are more like cultural norms and values and beliefs, or even legal codes. So that would be like what holds the movement together. In my assessment, what holds the 9/11 truth movement together is a collective recognition that there is empirical evidence that contradicts the official story of 9/11. So this idea of conspiratorial imaginaries is not well studied. I only found 38 articles referencing it, but typically it's used in a pejorative fashion. If you look at the third article down in this list, it says the September 11 attack served as a catalytic event that wove older narratives of government secrecy into new global conspiratorial imaginaries. In the aftermath of crisis, yada, yada, yada. So you can see like academics will use that phrase and they don't really unpack it or define it. It's kind of a technical term in that sense. But let me give you a sense of how this works. So if you look to the right, you see an image and it says iron rich sphere. Now, this is kind of like when I presented Cass Sunstein's face. And if by just seeing his face, you knew who he was, I said, I want to address that later on. Well, imagine that a member of the general public was shown these two images. Just about half of the public, we can say, but probably more, would see these images and probably have no clue what they're looking at. Like iron rich sphere, okay, I don't know what these other things are. Maybe they could see 1 millimeter and smaller, orange looking things. I would say that probably most, if not just many people in the 9/11 truth movement know what these images are. This is a part of the imaginary that holds the 9/11 truth movement together. It's a stock of knowledge that leads to a justified belief that there are serious contradictions of the official explanation of the events of September 11th. The members of the general public would have no idea what you're talking about. And even if you explained it to them and said, well, let me show you something else. Again, I think a lot of people in the 9/11 truth movement have at least some idea of what this image on the right is. And if you gave the general public a hint and you said WTC7, I think most people would still be like, what? Because that 2021 9/11 Truth Tap poll that I helped to conduct showed that only about half of the public even is aware that a third building collapsed. And beyond that, I doubt, now I need more data, but I doubt that they have much specific knowledge. So you said, well, this is David Chandler's graph from part 3 of NIST finally admits free fall that plots the velocity of WTC7's roofline versus time. You could explain it to them that, hey, this indicates there was a third building that collapsed, that free fall acceleration universally, symmetrically into its own footprint, much like other well known demolitions occurred. Even then, for many people who are not aware of the fact that these are well known, well studied events that have dozens of articles, full-length books written about this particular event, they would still have trouble like contextualizing it. Like, what does this mean? For people like myself, once I found out about World Trade Center Building 7, I was immediately shocked, just like many other people I interviewed, and is the reason why there was a Remember Building 7 campaign, Rethink Building 7 campaign, because we know this particular event is the smoking gun of 9/11. Now, I proposed an experiment to my institutional review board where I wanted to show people something like this GIF, and the experimental condition would be to tell people either beforehand or afterward that the building on the left was proposed by the government to have collapsed due to normal office fires. And I wanted to measure the outcome of whether or not they would change their initial assessment that, yes, all of these buildings look like they were demolished or collapsing in the same way. I was denied that because it would potentially lead to uh, traumatic conversion experiences if people woke up to 9/11 truth, or it might potentially cause people to become conspiracy theorists and therefore a danger to society. So I cannot achieve institutional approval of that particular study. Now, I would define the 9/11 truth movement as a network of individuals, groups, organizations, and communities tied together by social imaginaries. Notice I use the word social imaginaries, that laws of physics, empirical observations, and scientific analysis of evidence contradict the official authorized accounts of the events of September 11, 2001, produced by the 9/11 Commission, NIST, FEMA, and other institutions and organizations that perpetuate the lie commonly referred to as 9/11. Now, if I'm being normative or biased in this definition, it's probably there at the end where I call the official story a lie, but I think we've proven our case that it is. So, astonishingly to me, this is the image that's on the Wikipedia page for the 9/11 Truth Movement. And I'm glad that it's there, that it's still there. I'm kind of astonished, but I think it's a sign of success that at least they're willing to present on Wikipedia one of the central claims of the 9/11 Truth Movement. Now, I want to point out that, this is street activism. This is a repertoire of contention of social movements. This is not the social movement itself. This is something that social movements do, kind of like the civil rights movement engaging in sit-ins or active protests. Excuse me. However, on the official Wikipedia page, the 9/11 Truth Movement is defined as encompassing a disparate group of adherents to a set of overlapping conspiracy theories. And there's the problem, is that it would be very difficult to get that to change. And I know that because I attempted to do that several times. I went in and tried to change this. And I even said I said adherence to what are considered conspiracy theories, and they wouldn't even allow me to change it to considered. So I think that there's institutional control going on. But through the efforts of organizers like Jean and Sandra Laratonda, who are actively involved in organizing the 9/11 Truth Movement Facebook group, along with the 9/11 War Room, that has been growing over time from when I joined, I think about 30,000 members to 44,000 members. Now, whether or not these people are directly engaged and active in joining street protests, that's a matter for social movements scholarship, I think. There are what are called like activists, people who like posts, people who simply observe and gain information. Because imagine that there are what are called lurkers, people who just scroll and they don't comment, they don't like, but they're learning. And they might be discussing that information in their private lives with people around them. We just don't know. You have to have that data before you can make the analysis of who's being active and who's not. But there are active people and there are active events. The information on the screen here discusses much of the recent activity that's been going on with the 9/11 Truth Movement Group. The Boston 9/11 Truth Movement Group is very active, as indicated today, and with ongoing events. Susan Serpa has been frankly wonderful in interacting with me and inviting me here and giving me permission to share some of this information. which is an indication of the ongoing efforts of dedicated people who are oftentimes tirelessly and thinklessly engaged in raising awareness to the general public of the reasons why we are questioning 9/11. And I want to show this image because uh, Colorado 9/11 Truth is another active organization. But this particular image for me uh, brings about uh, an idea that's expressed through some different internet memes that you've probably seen. Like in one, there's an object that looks like a six or a nine, and there's two people pointing at it, one saying six, one saying nine. You could look at this image and you could, in your mind, say, oh, this is dawn. Another person could say, oh, this is dusk. Well, whether the six or the nine is a numerical number depends upon who put it there. It's not a matter of perception, like the Ash conformity experiment. Whether or not this is dusk or dawn depends on what time of day it is. It's a matter of empirical observation. It's a matter of reality. The truth does not change. There is a truth in reality. There are also perceptions, opinions, interpretations, and subjective experiences. These are not mutually exclusive. But I believe that over the past 25 years, there has been a dawning of 9/11 truth. And the sunrise is occurring through the gravity that's occurring through the accumulation of people joining the 9/11 truth movement. The list of resources, websites, has grown over the years. There's been an accumulation of it of in the generation of new research, new analyses through debates, discussions, the efforts of experts and professionals to concerned citizens who will continue, I believe, to present to the world what it is that we believe, which is that there is a truth to 9/11, and it is anything but what was presented in the 9/11 Commission report. So there you go.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. So I will take questions and answers right now. And raise your electronic hand. If you can't raise your electronic hand, I'll keep an eye on raising your virtual hand on top or your actual hand on your video, or you can put it in the chat. So first we have Jean and Sandra or Sandra.
Yeah, me.
Go
First,
ahead,
then me.
Yeah,
Sandra.
Jean's gonna want to talk right after me. Yeah, I again, so much to process and so much information and so many dots connecting, listening to you and all. I mean, it's just, again, you have to listen to it again because you can't take it all in. I wanted to go back to the earlier part, when you were talking about the experiments, about the Ash experiment specifically. Two notes on that one. One of them, at one point you said that the subject, who was the actual test subject, was influenced, had his perception influenced by the answers of the others. And I think, and I could be wrong, but when I did watch the experiment more than once, my takeaway is not that his perception was altered, but that he didn't have the courage to speak up. I think you saw his confusion on his face, like he thought he knew what the answer was, but he didn't have the courage to go up against what the others were saying. And there is a part in that experiment where they then introduce one subject who does give the correct answer. And I thought that that was so powerful because that shows how that is encouraging. And they say it, if one person has the courage to speak up, it encourages others to voice their, doubts and or their certainties or whatever. So I just wanted to add that in for those who are not familiar with it. And in the experiment section, and obviously can't go into all of it, but for anyone who wants to look into the Stanford prison experiment, that's another seriously almost disturbing experiment to look into. But again, that whole idea of authority dictating how people behave and giving people permission to do things that they would never ever do under normal circumstances. So I just wanted to quickly throw that in, but
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you're right. And you know, like in my when I teach about these, and these are pretty like the Milgram, Ash, Zimbardo, which is the Stanford Prison Study, the Roberts Cave Study. There are a series of experiments that were done that are routinely taught in the social sciences. My concern is that there's a lot of educators who miss the point. Like, it's not they're not just interesting studies. They're not just like, ethically concerning and things like that, but they point out the probability and the ability for open societies to be closed. And that's always the point that I try to drive home to make sure that my students are aware of, like, the reason that Milgram did these studies, the reason Zimbardo and Solomon did these studies, because they didn't want to manipulate people, they wanted to liberate people.
mm.
And so that's one thing. And there's another study that I'll point out, which is the Jane Elliott's brown eye, blue eye experiment. So
Oh yeah.
Jane Elliott was a school teacher in Iowa, and during the civil rights movement, after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, probably by the FBI, by the way, she wanted to address, racism in her class, and so her class was homogenous racially. And what she did was she divided the brown-eyed students and the blue-eyed students. And she gave I think initially the blue-eyed students all the privileges one day, said that they were better, basically broke them down, psychologically, divided the groups, and then she got results very similar to Zimbardo. But they, like what you were saying with the Ash study, in the video of her doing this, there are children who are like resistant. They're like, "Nuh-uh, we're not less than, nuh-uh." And in the Solomon Ash study, you can see the people who are like looking like, "What? Like, why is that?" And it's not initially like on the first attempt that they conform. It's only after repeated uh, sets of going through that they eventually, you can see their will breaking down, and they're just kind of like, I don't know why we're doing this. And then there's another one I like to show in my methods course of like a doctor's office where a bunch of Confederates are in the doctor's office. They ring a bell, everybody stands up, and then they introduce new people one by one. And eventually, everybody in the room who is standing up at the bell was never instructed to do that. They are simply conforming to the group behavior. And this is a phenomenon that is rooted in human nature. By nature, human beings are social beings. We crave sociality. That's why one of the worst punishments that you can do to a child is put them in timeout or ground them. And actually, what is torture to an adult is to isolate them in solitary confinement. Like, extended periods of solitary confinement do lead to psychosis and immune breakdown, etc. So we are deeply fundamentally social creatures, but we're also symbolic creatures. We think in terms of language and pictures and symbols and signs and things like that. And what that means is that a label can be attached to the identity of a person. And that's how the conspiracy theory label functions, is that people have a sense of the world generally. And if the good people don't question their teachers, they don't question the news, or if they do it within an acceptable framework, then they psychologically know that the bad people are those conspiracy theorists. And so all they have to do is conform to the majority. Anytime they're confronted with these incongruent facts, they are prepared psychologically by the propagandists who are inducing resistance to conspiracy theories, and then they're psychologically safe. So that's, I think, the context of all of those experiments and studies in terms of 9/11 truth. And there's a lot more to be said, but yeah, you can see the people like initially resisting, like on the day of 9/11, why did the buildings collapse like that? And immediately they had a story. Well, it's because of the heat and the fire and the impact and all that kind of stuff. Oh, well, I guess that makes sense. And then it's repeated enough, sinks in, and people who question it are outlandish conspiracy theorists.
And it's more comforting to them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Also, adding on to that Bell experiment with the people who eventually were all replaced, there's that 5-monkey experiment or the monkey ladder experiment. It's the same thing happened. Before I ask my question, I wanted to show one other neat thing was Cass Sunstein's paper, basically drilling 9/11 conspiracy theorists, came out in June 2009. Everybody's available to do this or capable of doing this. Google Trends, you can search back to 2004. So I put in 9/11 and conspiracy theorists, and it peaked in September of 2009. This is just a few months after Cass Sunstein's paper was written. So it accomplished its goal. My question was, I heard when you did your studies and you were talking about the ash experiment, you were going to conduct an experiment and you ran into some grief. I'd love to hear that story.
Yeah, so if you want to publish research in a peer-reviewed journal or even present it at an academic conference, then to uphold academic integrity, you must have institutional review board approval. Now, the institutional review board has a history to it that dates back to the Nuremberg trials, to some of the human experiments that were conducted, and to, for example, the Tuskegee experiments, in which African Americans were allowed to have syphilis and spread it in their communities after the cure was found. So there are good reasons that we want to have institutional oversight because, even like Milgram's study, Zimbardo's study, they were unethical because there were people who thought they killed people. There were people who essentially tortured other people, in these conditions. And so what happens is you have to convince the institutional review board that the benefits of your study outweigh the costs. It's a utilitarian argument. And alongside that, you have a Kantian deontological categorical imperative, which is do no harm, right? So you have to balance these things out, which is like, first of all, do no harm. But if you have to deceive your subjects, if there is a potential for any type of harm, then you have to show that the potential benefits outweigh the harms. Well, this is back in 2011 or 12. No, this would have been back in 2010 or 11. And, this is like 9 or 10 years after 9/11. And those kooky loose change, people, they're just out of their minds. And Ellefritz, you want to do what now? You want to study these 9/11 conspiracy theorists. And I was like, well, I don't think we should call them conspiracy theorists because I think that's an ethical abridgment because that label is stigmatizing. And they were kind of like, what? So I kind of knew that I was already dealing with an oversight committee who was subscribed to the dominant paradigm. And at the time I had multiple studies that I wanted to do. The one that you're referencing was an experimental design in which in an experiment what you do is you get a group of people and then you randomly select them into two different groups, the experimental condition and the control condition, because you want them to be as similar as possible. With the with one group, with the now I'm having to think back, with the control group, I wanted to essentially, I was going to ask. Okay, now I'm putting it together. I wanted to show both groups the collapse of World Trade Center 7. Write down what it is that you think caused this building to collapse. So just, do you know what this is? What built, and if they have no clue, okay, what do you think caused it to collapse? And likely it would be they think it's controlled demolition because that's what it looks like. One experimental condition is you set it side by side, other known demolitions, or you mix in World Trade Center 7 to other known demolitions, and you get them to all report first what caused the building to collapse. And likely they would all say demolition or something like that. Then the experimental condition would be to inform the participants in a number of conditions. Actually, the official explanation for why this building collapsed is due to normal office fires. So what is your assessment now? And to measure whether or not there would be a change. So my supposition was that, if you measure a whole bunch of other knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs, there would be a correlation between people who would be willing to change their mind. So if you're more open-minded, if you're more skeptical, maybe more rational, you might be willing to say, oh, wait a minute, no, my initial observation is correct. How could that have collapsed due to fire? Because it resembles all these other buildings. Other people would experience cognitive dissonance and say, oh, well, I guess the government is kind of always right and they're good, just, true, and fair. Therefore, that one must have collapsed due to fire. The reason that that was not accepted is because I had preliminary data at the time that I had to discuss with the IRB, and it shows that many people who woke up to 9/11 truth reported that they experienced depression, anxiety, disruptions to their social, personal, romantic, and occupational lives. And so the IRB essentially told me, so you're saying that it's possible that people might begin to start to convert to a conspiracy theorist belief system, and therefore they would experience these potentially psychological trauma. And I said, yes, that's potential. Well, what benefit to society would that be? How are you going to convince people who believe the official story that that's beneficial?
That would have been great. I don't know if you can get funding for that outside of the. That would be good. I'd love to
We're
see that.
working
Thank
on
you.
it.
Thank you.
All right, so I also have a question. I want to apologize to everyone. My camera's not working tonight. Hopefully next time it'll be fixed by then. But so I'm the daughter of a psychologist, and my daughter is an archaeologist. So I'm very interested in psychology, sociology, but also anthropology. And I think that really leads to the social aspects of human beings. We're not very equipped mammals on this planet. We have inadequate ears, eyes, feet, teeth, claws, etc. So we have survived and thrived because of our social behavior, because we belong to tribes that support us. That's deep rooted in our psyche. It's not just a matter of, oh, I must be accepted to be my peers. No, it's a matter of survival. It's an instinct to survival. So this is where I feel is number one, it's fascinating for those to me to know why people break out of that mold, why we what special circumstances in their lives allowed them to break out of that mold. Why do we have a 9/11 truth movement? Why do we have people who question against the official narratives? What's special about those people? And secondly, just how do we help others break out of that mold? So if you can address that, thank you.
Yeah. So in the presentation that I made on December 14th, which again is available at ic911.org, I made the point that I had gone back and watched several of David Ray Griffin's lectures on process theology. So I was asked to, give the third annual David Ray Griffin lecture. I knew a lot about his 9/11 research. I decided, you know what? I don't know much more about the man than that. And I learned a lot about process theology, but I also learned a lot about David Ray Griffin, the man before September 11th, so like in the 80s. And he said something at one point that was kind of startling to me, where he was like, credulous or skeptical of theories of the afterlife. And he thought these people were kooks until he went and read their research. And in his words, he found out they're not kooks after all. They have good reason to make the claims that they're making. And so I found that to be a very open-minded statement. And my point in that section was to kind of give some recognition, but also I pointed out that there are psychologists who in their studies they found that open-minded thinking and superstitious thinking are two of the top predictors of beliefs in false conspiracy theories. Well, I would have a different interpretation of those results, right? Like my interpretation would be, well, no, like people who are open-minded, which is a basic psychological characteristic. So, like one of the theories of personality is called the Big Five, in which you have it's OCEAN, ocean, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So some people are more or less open-minded, and to be open-minded can be a virtue. Like you're more or less accepting of new ideas. You want to try new foods, new experiences. It can also be a vice. You can get yourself into a lot of trouble, trying and believing new things. You can be like too open-minded where you just accept every new idea that comes along. You don't critically evaluate it. Just like closed-mindedness can be a virtue or a vice. So these psychologists believe that they are studying a phenomenon that is at its base irrational and potentially dangerous. And they've come up with a number of predictors and indicators of who it is that's going to believe in conspiracy theories. I have a different interpretation of the results. I think what they're really doing is they're studying the types of people who have the psychological resilience and the cognitive capacity to entertain the idea that they individually and society is lied to on a mass scale, which can be psychologically frightening to come to the realization that your educators, the media, government is lying to you, and that there's all these people surrounding you that believe the lie. That can be very frightening. You'd have to be psychologically resilient to work your way through that. And of course, coming to that realization would, be shocking, which it is. So first of all, like going back, you have people like David Ray Griffin, and dare I say myself. Like I'm just going to use myself as an example and David Ray Griffin. For whatever reason, David Ray Griffin became like one of the preeminent scholars of process theology. He was a rigorous scholar. He was widely read, well versed. Had an occupation dealing with critical thinking and that type of stuff. And I know from personal experience going through my psychology, sociology, and sociology degrees, all four of them, I had to go through a series of processes where I trained my brain. I was disciplined mentally, and the I thought I was a well-educated person, well-informed. I'm smart. I'm a critical thinker. And that's why World Trade Center 7 was so shocking to me, because my initial interpretation was, I should have known about this. Why didn't I know about this? Like, not knowing about this indicates to me that I was lied to. Like, there was information withheld to me about one of the most significant events of my lifetime and recent history. What does this mean? What are the implications? But I was also the type of person who self-selected into a social science program because I'm a very curious, open-minded, exploratory, skeptical person. Like I want data, I want to analyze it. I'm a critical thinker. And in a lot of my interviews that I did with people of various stations in life, ages, professions, gender, socioeconomic status, really, I found a lot of people who are very critical in their thinking, like critical thinkers. People who have the ability to think for themselves. Well, if you're proposing, which I agree with, that sociality is a net benefit to human beings at the individual level. Like we're not well equipped individually to deal with planet Earth. We're born helpless, naked. We depend upon other people for protection and food and things like that. Then it's not good for the group to have independent minded people. It's not good for the group if everybody's a critical thinker and everybody thinks individualistically. It leads to essentially chaos. Okay. But over time, like I said with the 11th man, right? That like if we can systematically have an 11th person whose job it is to be skeptical. Think about court jesters. Like, why would kings and queens and emperors have a court jester? Well, it's in part to keep the king honest, that you have a person whose job it is and who is allowed to make statements publicly that kind of put the king in check. And what that does is kind of like what Steven Pinker's book was pointing out, everyone knows. So when everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows, then we can overcome pluralistic ignorance. So if a court jester ridicules the king on something and there are people around to hear it, then everybody knows that everybody knows that everybody knows that was pointed out. So I think there's a function socially for, having people who are uh you know who are able and ready and equipped to entertain some of the let's say some of the worst hypotheses. It's not easy. Okay, let me challenge the psychologist one more time just to kind of buttress my answer to your question. There's a line of kind of like I pointed out in my presentation on the big events and big causes theory that was generated back in the 70s. That the reason these people think that there's a conspiracy, they can't handle that small people can cause big events, is what their false explanation is. There's also a line of research by psychologists that says, well, uh, one of the factors of conspiracy theory belief is that you feel special. You feel safe and secure knowing that you have special knowledge that the mass of society doesn't have. And it also allows you to believe that the world is in control. Because for some reason, these psychologists have a God's eye point of view on the earth where they know, allegedly, that the world is in chaos and there's nobody in control and there's none of these big events that can be orchestrated. And I'm like, and I have a reinterpretation of that. I'm like, well, first of all, uh, I've interviewed many people who are paranoid, because you're going to say that people are paranoid, but then they feel safe and secure. Like, yes and no. And, people have told me, I don't want to believe these things. Like, you really want to believe that your government is capable of pulling off 9/11 and then orchestrating a perpetuation of propaganda used to fearmonger people into perpetual wars abroad? That's not fun to believe in. And then when they say, oh, we want to have special knowledge to feel like we are superior to others, really? Then tell me why it is that the 9/11 truth movement exists. Why are all of these people trying to share their knowledge to increase that information in public society? It doesn't really make us special if everybody knows what we know. So again, I think these psychologists are propagandists carrying out a line of research started by the CIA. And what they've really been studying are the psychologically resilient critical thinkers who are capable of entertaining what they call conspiracy theories.
Thank you very much. Jerry, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, hopefully my audio is sorted out now. Can you hear me, Richard? Great presentation. Again, enjoyed it every bit as much as your one in December, which I've watched twice now. My question's more about demographics. In other words, the people that we're trying to reach, the people that we have reached. You said that about a third of people knew about Building 7. And I can't remember when that was, 2014 or when. Sorry?
So in 2021,
okay,
the poll that we conducted showed that 52% of people were aware of World Trade Center 7.
Okay, so now what I'm trying to imagine here is how many people knew about Building 7 before the 9/11 attacks? Not very many. How many people knew about the Twin Towers before the 9/11 attacks? Just about everybody. Almost universal. So therefore, from a demographic point of view, by the nature of what we do, we are cutting ourselves down to the people who are intellectually open to looking at a conspiracy theory, whether it's to denigrate it or whether it's to embrace it, or just to examine it, even from a neutral point of view. aren't we cutting down our demographic here? In other words, we've done the Building 7 thing. We've got those people. If we can do that with Building 7, Building 7 was a controlled demolition. I think we can all agree on that. It can be said to be a controlled demolition because of the inadequacies in the report and because of the observed structural behaviour in the building. People see it. There's no difference between the towers, and there is not a straight frame of reference for Building 7, but there is for both the Twin Towers. Do you think that as a movement, all of us collectively are guilty of saying, okay, we've proved Building 7's a demolition, that is enough? Whereas if we moved on progressively to the towers, then what we're doing is we're setting up a knockout punch there after an uppercut, you know, hitting people with the Building 7 thing. In other words, the narrative hasn't really changed in the last 10 years. It really hasn't changed. And how do we do? First of all, I suppose, do you agree with that? And how do we get to that point where we progress the narrative? So we're talking about the buildings, A, that people got killed in, and B, the buildings that everybody cares about and knows, let's face it.
Yeah, if you go to the 9/11 Truth Movement Facebook group, and if you're able to search back far enough in that group to, you know, around 2013 and 15, that exact debate was happening because there were people who were like, why are we wasting our money on putting up billboards about Building 7 in New York, you know, and across from New York Times? Like, you know, shouldn't we move on? And the reason that they did that was because that was the key issue that was most likely to wake people up. You know, like it was kind of collectively decided, and I found it in my research, like time and time again, the people I interviewed in New York, you know, what brings you down here? What woke you up? World Trade Center 7, or it was something like loose change, and it works differently for different people. So I on the one hand, I completely agree with you and understand what you're saying, right? So like it's kind of like we're beating a dead horse, singing to the choir, you know, like why aren't we moving on or expanding our repertoire of discussion? And wouldn't it be more likely that since the Twin Towers were so regularly used in scenes of New York City and you know and driven into the popular imagination, and that's where people died, like shouldn't that be the focus? Well, what's your goal? You know, it's always what's the goal here? If the goal is to wake people up, then it's what's effective. And on a broad scale, what's been more effective is alerting people to the third tower that collapsed on a broad scale. Individually, it depends on the person. Like there are people who, yeah, Building 7, I'm sure that can be explained. There are people who are like, you know what really puzzles me is that Flight 93 crash in Pennsylvania, and that's where they're focused. So there's a difference at the level of analysis where individually, well, it depends on the person, and then you got to find out what they believe and what they know. But on a broad scale, like if you had, let's say that you had $1 million, and it was like, here's $1 million, alert the public to something, what are you going to do? And what I would suggest is like, well, first conduct a preliminary survey with some of the money, find out kind of what shifts people's attitudes or what they're most concerned about, and then you would have to find a media mechanism to, you know, sort of alert people, and then hope after the fact that they're going to follow up with some website that you have so you can contact them and then direct them towards what? Well, there's you know about 25 years of work that's been done on this. So anybody waking up now, they've got, you know, on the one hand, they've got all the research that's already been done on all the different subjects that you can think of, like from the most minuscule microscopic, you know, dust analyses to the grand global geopolitical strategy and things like that. They've already got that research. Well, on the other hand, that's very overwhelming. So it's like, what would you point them to sort of indicate there's much more, there's serious, you know, empirical work that's been done by multitudes of people. Again, on the one hand, it's the individual. They should be able to self-select. And what would be interesting, I think, in that you point out is that there is in fact new research or new analyses that are done. And this was done at Turning the Tide event. Piers Robinson presented that they had been doing a simulator study. They need more funding of getting pilots to try to simulate flying a plane into the Pentagon. They couldn't get the pilots to be able to do it, and they're saying this is evidence that likely a piloted plane was not able to fly into the Pentagon. Then Walters showed new analysis of seismographic evidence that shows that there were seismographic indications of something happening before the planes hit. I think that that's new analysis, and there is new debate, discussion, and analysis going on beyond World Trade Center 7. There's also geopolitical analysis and historical comparative analysis, and this is what I observed at Turning the Tide event, along with, and this is my last thing I'll say, along with the debate about the Pentagon, because like think about it sociologically here. It's not just about what actually occurred, right? Like the events that occurred, if you had a time machine, you could go back and you could observe them accurately and know exactly what happened. But left with the information and evidence that we have, another thing that's going on are the current debates and discussions. Like there's a current ongoing debate and discussion, and there are people who would want to funnel people one way or funnel people another way. So I think the reality of the situation is that that the 9/11 truth movement is still entertaining new analyses. It's like when you think about it broadly and like what is everybody in the 9/11 truth movement discussing? Like what's the one thing? Well, yeah, you could point out World Trade Center 7, but today the reason that my focus was on that is because my focus is on that. Like that's what I chose to analytically focus on. So I kind of created a tunnel vision here. There's a lot more that's going on that I just didn't include that I think it's important. There's a lot of people discussing and talking about these things. I don't know what would be effective at alerting the public to the anomalies in the official story. Like I just don't have that data.
Okay, thanks very much. And please keep doing presentations. I think your angle on it, sort of non-technical, the sociological, the psychological point of it is very much been overlooked. And certainly you're up there with Mr. David Ray Griffin. Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
So Mike Cook is next. Go ahead, Mike. You're muted.
You're muted.
So you got
There
it?
you go. Yep.
Yeah. Great job. Thank you so much. I just had a couple of points. I'd be surprised if you haven't been aware of, read An Active State by William Pepper. Really?
You are surprised.
I'm surprised. Yeah, there was a lawsuit. The King family sued the alleged assassin for $1 to get into civil court. He was dying and he was going to be gone soon, and the jury was like in and out. The court proceeding went on for a long time, and it took them like 15-30 minutes, and they said, yeah, he didn't do it. And all the evidence points, where it points. And the other thing was, it was interesting to me, the solitary confinement thing and the tribal thing. I get all that. However, some of us are quite comfortable being hermits. I mean, depending on your life experience and I guess your psychological makeup. I would be fine. Actually, it would be a relief to never have to look at or hear from or speak to another human being as long as I live. I would be an excellent hermit, but I wouldn't be doing the world a whole lot of good that way. And sometimes I have fun with people. I'm not like antisocial or anything, but that's an interesting development, I guess. That some people are just like, this is sick. Oh, the quote, Carissa Muerte, is that, I'm not sure how you say his name. It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, and so I'll just kind of take that in order. Like with the MLK trial, like one of the or sorry, like many of the efforts, especially by the lawyers committee, who I think, in my opinion, deserve a lot of congratulations, and the various petitions to institute a grand jury. And I participated in disseminating literature to Congress on two separate occasions, and getting Senator Ron Johnson involved potentially for a Senate hearing. So, like getting the courts or getting Congress or getting some institutional lever to be involved in the investigation can kind of lend that credibility, if nothing else, if not justice, if not consequences. It's the credibility to be able to point back and say, well, a civil suit found that, what was his name? I forget MLK's assassin's name. Found that he wasn't culpable, right? And so you're able to point those things out if we're not able to achieve justice. So in the court proceedings, I think that there's been a lot of notable and worthy efforts. Sirhan was RFK. So there's been a lot of
James
notable and
Earl
worthy
Ray.
efforts. That's it, James Earl Ray.
They always
Um,
have three names,
always got
John
three
Wilkes
names.
Booth.
Yeah.
And I've accidentally called him James Earl Jones, and I'm like, no, it wasn't Darth Vader. It was, James Earl Ray. Um, then with the like, let's say your disposition to be comfortable in long terms of isolation, right? Like I get it. My dad is, essentially a hermit, and I'm so concerned. He's retired. I'm like, how you doing? How you doing? And he's like, I'm fine. And he's got his two or three friends, and he's fine. And I'm kind of like that too. I'm like, I see enough people when I go to work and I interact with my students and my colleagues. I'm good.
Yeah.
But there's a variety. Some say the variety is the spice of life, and the fact of the matter is that there's a great amount of variation psychologically, social psychologically, and sociologically. One of the explanations for why it is that people deviate from social norms, that comes from sociology, is what's called differential association theory. So differential meaning that you have a different experience than other people have. You're like, even if your siblings, if you're younger or older, you were treated different than your younger or older sibling. Okay. So there are people who grow up in homes and in neighborhoods who have a very different experience than most people have. And therefore, their actual life is kind of conditioned in a way that leads them to like more easily questioning social reality. Now, a lot of times they question rules and laws, and that explains like why they break rules and laws. But what do conspiracy theorists do if not break the cardinal sin of questioning the official story of historical events? So we're a, we're a variety of people who probably have a lot of different backgrounds and psychological characteristics that lead to that type of psychological resilience and critical thinking and capacity for stocks of knowledge. How much knowledge do you have to be able to answer all the questions that a debunker might throw at you, right? So that difference in variety, I think, are a component of factors that probably lead people to the ability to, hold the disturbing thoughts that we're lied to, that there's false flag domestic terror events and things like that. Um,
I would say too, climate change, if you're educated on that, it's like very, very scary. It doesn't matter what we do in terms of like legality, and 9/11 is minor compared to the destruction of the ecosystem. And yet you go through your day.
and, and I forgot what your final point was that you brought up earlier. I'm trying to think. Um,
Uh, we did active state and that hermit thing. Is there something else? Oh, I put a link in the chat. You mentioned David Ray Griffin and the afterlife. I'm not familiar with his. I need to go check that out. I got a note, but there were a series of experiments in Tucson, Arizona when I was living there, and I had a personal kind of spooky experience at that time. It leads me to believe that those experiments were on the level. This dude had these he was a professor at the University of Arizona, and he got these mediums, and they were contacting the other side. You know, that folks that were deceased could be reached by some people. You know, these mediums. It seems like in my opinion, it's on the level.
You know, and it very well could be. I,
Yeah.
my point there with David Griffin along those lines is imagine two different types of people. One who's like, nah, or a similar person who's like, oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But you ask either one of them, like, well, what have you read? Like, what evidence do you have or something like that? And they both say, well, I don't know. Like, that's just what I believe. Versus another type of person who's either dismissive or they're very minded. And, you engage them in a conversation and they're willing to look at the evidence. They're willing to entertain a counter argument. I met an engineer once who I was going back and this is in 2010. I was going back and forth with, and we were on a pool league together, met weekly. And finally, I said to him, out of the two of us, I'm the one who's acting more scientifically because, like, I already know all of the information that you know, and you're not willing to even look at any of the information that I've said. So you're the one who's not acting scientifically. You've not evaluated any of the evidence that I've offered. And he goes, you know what, you're right. And I was like, I know I'm right, but he's like, you know what, you're right. E email me some links. And so I sent him, for example, I sent him Fabled Enemies by Burmis, Jason
Mhm.
Burmis, and I sent him Architects and Engineers documentary at the time. It wasn't Blueprint, Explosive Evidence. He watched Fabled Enemies first, and he was like, and he told me, he's like, yeah, that one I didn't really like. He's like, yeah, that was just more of your conspiracy stuff. He's like, but I watched Explosive Evidence, and he's like, yep, yep, they demolished those towers. And then he went back and watched Fabled Enemies, and then he could entertain the geopolitical content. So
Yeah,
it's that,
I try to
it's that,
I try
well,
to make that.
it's that
Okay.
it's that type of individual who's willing to take a look at the evidence, and that's kind of what was brought up earlier. Is like, well, what evidence should we show them? And it's like, well, it depends on the person. Like you don't know what's going to work on any given individual.
Yeah, yeah. I thank you. I make that point too. I use the analogy that you can't teach algebra until somebody can add, subtract, multiply, and divide. You can't teach them to read until they've got an alphabet. You know. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have three more questions and we want to move on to the second portion of our agenda at 8:30. So got to move it along now. Thank you. Roy, you're next.
Yes, this should be quick. Thank you for the presentation. It was interesting. You did talk about I think you mentioned a Facebook group between 30,000 and 40,000 members. It so happens like 3 or 4 days ago, I checked the memberships of all the 9/11 truth groups that came up in a Facebook search. And I think you might be confusing a group called 9/11, the Biggest Lie Movement, with another group. If I can get this up, uh, this is my file here. You can see that one, the Biggest Lie Movement, 9/11 has 35,000 members. and which is twice as big as the 9/11 Truth Movement and 3 times as big as the 9/11 Truth Movement. So that's I think you might be confusing this Biggest Lie group with one of the other ones.
I don't think so.
The interesting thing, I was interested. Yeah. Yes. Excuse me.
I don't think so.
No.
Well,
Let-
that's straight off of Facebook. You can look that up yourself.
Yeah.
I have.
You look up the group, and you
Roy,
can see
Roy.
how many members are in 9/11 Truth Movement, how many members are in that. I'm sure that will be what you see, because it's not going to show me one thing and you another thing. The interesting thing about this 9/11, the Biggest Lie movement, is how it has ballooned in membership over the last couple of weeks. And, I won't go into a big thing about it, but I think Facebook is promoting this group, and that's why it has so many members all of a sudden. But I won't go into that any further. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Can I
no,
just jump
I agree.
in?
Go
Since
ahead, Sandra.
admin that page, my guess, Roy, and I wouldn't know anything about it, is that you cannot see the page because at one point you were probably banned from it. That if you're banned from a group, then you can't see the group. But the one that Richard is referring to is at, I believe, now 44,000 members. So it is out there. It's just not showing up in your stats.
What's the precise name of that group?
It's the 9/11 Truth, just like the public one. The public one is the sister of it. But the original one is a closed group, which was why they created the second one. Long story. But it's just the 9/11 Truth Movement.
Well, that's what this one's called, the 9/11 Truth Movement, with 11,000 members. Are there two groups?
I think it's called. I think, Sandra, it's just 9/11 Truth Movement.
Yeah.
That there's one with a the on it, but your group has no the.
Sorry,
Yeah.
yes.
Well,
You're right.
both of them are in this. I saw both of them.
No,
No.
Roy, it's neither one of those. I'm telling you right now.
No,
I'm
hold on.
find it.
So I'm asking, what's the name? Are there two groups with the exact same name?
Yes.
That's
No.
what.
One of them is a closed group, and it's not available for public searches.
Oh, it's
And
available for public
well,
searches,
like on you.
but you
What I
can't see
meant
the
is,
post. Yeah.
what I meant is, yeah, like from Google, you can't search it. So the other one, yeah, I'm accurate, and I know that I am. I appreciate you bringing that up. I really do, because I've done that myself, and I actually, if you want to send that to me, you're going to do me a big service because I want those numbers. One of those is even my group, 9/11 Satyagraha, but
Uh-huh.
I was in the 9/11 Truth Movement Facebook group when it was closed down. So I was witness to that event, and I was studying it thoroughly at the time. And the screenshot in my presentation was from Sandra's post, who's an administrator, and she said that there was 44,000 members in, and I went in to verify it, and there were around 44,000 members. I doubt the group's been deleted in the meantime. So
Yeah.
I
Okay, well,
believe
it's quite possible. I thought I was reinstated in a group I was banned from, and it was very interesting that people were thrown out of that group for saying that there weren't passenger airliners that hit the towers, so that was suppressed. And anybody, the same thing with architects and engineers. They weren't having people who said the passenger airlines didn't hit the towers. That was suppressed in architects and engineers too. Okay, that's my 2 minutes. Go ahead.
I think, Sue, I was actually next, I think, in line, and because I piped in with a comment there, I lost my raised hand. So I think I'm actually next.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, good. Thanks. I'll try to be concise. A couple of things that you mentioned in this are I want to comment on. I want to sort of fold into a question. The whole question of Building 7 being a good way to introduce people to the subject. I agree with that. That's what got me started. Was a friend of mine told me about Building 7 like in 2007, and I had not even heard of it at that point. So it definitely grabbed my attention. But immediately after that, I said, well, what about the towers? And I started reading Griffin's books about and getting into all the details about the towers. And then I came across the documentary National Security Alert that the CIT guys did on the Pentagon, and it was like, well, if that's a lie, then the other, what about this other part of 9/11? What about this other part? So my concern is that people they're so concerned about, like, we have to start with Building 7 because that's a good way to bring people in. We end up kind of suppressing other important evidence that people might well then move on to. And I hear this so often in the movement, this idea that, well, we shouldn't talk about the Pentagon because we want people to start on Building 7. But the Pentagon's really, I would argue, critical. It's, as I've said a million times, it's, if this scene was staged, which it obviously was, then there's only one entity that could have done the staging, and that's the government. So it's vitally important, and it seems to me it's important that we not suppress it in the interest of catching new people, because new people, if anybody's really interested, they're going to want to go from one thing to the next, and they're going to say, well, what about that Flight 93 in Pennsylvania? What about that? So that's the first part of I have two sort of elements, and I don't know if you want me to just quickly whip the other one off before you comment. The second one is, I think, on the whole conspiracy theory label, I would argue that there is a faction within the 9/11 truth movement that is using that label to suppress positions from other people in the movement. And I would like to read you a quote from a statement that David Chandler and Jonathan Cole wrote a statement on the Pentagon in 2011. And they were talking about just sort of criticizing the idea that no plane hit the Pentagon. And here's the quote. It said, on the other hand, the mystery that surrounds the Pentagon makes it an attractive target of speculation and the subject of truly wild conspiracy theories. This kind of attractive diversion is sometimes called a honeypot or setup to be discredited at a later time. This is not the only instance of theories that seem designed to be easily discredited. There are groups that insist the towers at the World Trade Center were taken down by space lasers. Others claim no planes hit the Twin Towers at all. They were just holograms. What a better way to tar the movement than to seed it with absurdly false theories that fuel a media circus while making the movement look ridiculous. So that was Chandler and Cole's way of discrediting the claim that no plane hit the Pentagon. So I find it interesting that they're using the very tactics that you're highlighting in your presentation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I'll point out that in my previous presentation that I gave last night, which I mentioned earlier, I had actually gone into more depth over the model that I used in my doctoral dissertation. And the model explains sort of the function of the conspiracy theorist label, like generally speaking. So
Can you push that script full screen?
Is it now?
Yes.
Okay, so down here in the lower left, you'll see that there's a shaded area in blue. And what that visually represents is the stigmatizing function of a conspiracy label for outsider claims makers, like the 9/11 Truth Movement. Then, when you have debates with like relatively within boundaries, so like insider, outsider claims makers, the delegitimizing function already stigmatizes and is a strategy of exclusion that Husting and Orr pointed out. I have no doubt that same principle operates within the box on the bottom. So the box on the bottom is the 9/11 Truth Movement. And you see how that there's a interactional arrow between the two circles. That would be, for example, like between the two sides of the debate about the Pentagon at the 9/11 Turning the Tide event. At that particular debate, um, I I would have to revisit it, but I'm not sure that I saw the types of things that you just read to me out of that quote. Out of that quote, I would say, yes, that fits the pattern that I have seen before, generally in the public, where people like Michael Shermer and Jonathan Kay and some well-known quote unquote debunkers will do things like, well, these 9/11 truthers believe that there were teams of CIA who rigged the buildings with dynamite to bring them down. And these are the same types of people who think that Obama wasn't born in the United States, or that the moon landing was a hoax, or that they're shape-shifting reptilians. And it's like, wait, whoa, 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 whoa. First of all, who said anything about CIA and dynamite? Nobody. So where did that come from? And then how did you get from that all the way over to, you know, shape-shifting reptilians? So I will say, yes, I do think that you are accurate in saying that there are parallels in the broader landscape of anti-conspiracy discourse in that framework. Again, I don't know that I saw that come out during the debate. So what I think is um, more healthy is that type of public forum where people are in real time held accountable for what they're saying, because it's easier to sort of lob something over the trenches that are dug between the groups, and when you're not face to face with somebody, like the way that we talk to people on social media is different than the way that we talk to people face to face. And then especially because that debate was recorded for the public to see. So for me, like, I think that debate stands itself, and that was a really good example of where the dynamics are at in terms of the critical analysis. What you're talking about is the rhetorical tactics and strategies involved in the discourse that sort of go on outside of the public view. And I do think that that's a matter of concern and deserves attention, because it we should treat we should treat each other with more respect. And even if it's somebody like a James Fetzer proposing that mini nukes were involved, or a Judy Wood that was proposing that directed energy weapons were involved, if I'm going to put it into writing, I'm not going to insult and lambast and use rhetorical tactics to diminish their character. I will address them head on in writing. If I was face to face, I might lob an insult if I was feeling dicey and they were pushing me back, but again, like, we're dealing with real human beings who have more or less sincere, authentic, open agendas, and sometimes hidden agendas. And it's difficult to know which is which. But I think you pointed out something that, yeah, I think I see what you're saying.
Well, if I can just quickly throw in a quick comment about you mentioned the Washington thing. I mean, in the Washington thing, David Chandler repeated some of the blatantly, I would say dishonest, but let's just say false claims about the way that the CIT researchers approached the witnesses that they interviewed, and in particular Lloyd England, the taxi driver. They continued to say blatantly false things about this, and I was standing right next to them when they did it, and I did in fact call them out on it within the limits of that format. But the interesting thing about that is, I guarantee you not one person in the truth movement, particularly the more notable figures, are ever going to follow up on that and challenge it, David Chandler or Wayne Costi. No one will do it. And that's a big red flag for me. Why is nobody prepared to stand up to that sort of thing? I mean, I don't know that you necessarily have to know that, but I mean,
it's an interesting empirical question.
If I may interject.
Indeed.
Move on. We have two more questions and we're running.
Okay. Never mind. Hey, I'm saying pick your battles. You've chosen that one. There's a hell of a lot to take care of, and sometimes I just let things go because it's not worth the fight. You think it is? Go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, but
well, truth is worth the fight, I think.
We're running over time, so we need to, and we have two more questions, and we're going to have to keep those next two questions really short. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm in my car.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. No, I just so I find that what waking people up to Building 7 is the number one way to wake people up in general to any conspiracy theories. Just the whole idea of being a conspiracy theorist. That's like the number one way to do it. And I just wondered if you had any research on how effective that is. If you did a study on that, like showing people Building 7 compared to all other ways, it would be an important thing to do a research paper on to show how effective that is, because you're actually seeing something with your eyes. You're not, hearing it from someone's point of view. You're looking at a real physical phenomenon. Being an engineer, anyone with technical background can just look at that and say, "Oh my gosh," and their whole world changes when they watch that video. Yeah. You care to comment on that? Yeah.
Sure. I don't have experimental evidence on that. I do have data for my research that what woke most people up that I interviewed was World Trade Center 7. That's one of the reasons behind the rethink camp.
Oops, you're frozen. Uh-oh.
Along with that, like you said, that's a good way to, Building 7 is a good way to wake people up to other conspiracy theories.
Correct.
Well,
correct.
Over the past 5 years, there have been people who have been woken up to multiple things related to the pandemic, the election, riots, etc., who are now backing into 9/11. So now they're more open the other way around. And then it would depend, and I would conjecture that World Trade Center 7 would be the easiest way to get them into 9/11, but I don't know. And so I think it's a great question. There's a person I met recently who's very interested in this, and God willing, they might fund a study, but at this point, that's all I can say.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Al, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm fascinated on a college level. You're having done this work. At a point, it becomes the expression TMI, too much information to absorb. I've always been an advocate for keeping it simple, stupid. I sell real estate, and trying to draw into a conversation. One of the things that 110-story building dropped to the ground in 12 seconds. I mean, that was the most blatantly obvious bunch of bullshit I ever heard. And Building 7 as well. So my advice is, I don't know if you have the simplest message in your activism on the street in the way of a sign. I'm always trying to think of new ways to hook people in, but I'd be interested to know if you have your favorite 9/11 sign that you find most people accept most, short of Building 7 didn't blow itself up, which I think is really a good one.
Yeah.
And
Well, so I'll back into that with saying I think the least effective signs are 9/11 was an inside job. I get where that's coming from, but as a message to the public, it's taken as offensive, right? Like 9/11 was an inside job. Oh, you're one of those government did it people, and then they can dismiss it. And then it's a matter of like, well, like marketing strategies. What works in marketing? Information? Do we see commercials on TV that tell us all the factual details of the products? No, it's emotional appeal, you know. Um, so, alerting people to the facts is one approach, and I do, I do kind of side with that, which is like something about World Trade Center 7 or, a call to action, investigate 9/11. Well, investigate what? Like what do I put into Google here? So I don't know that I can right now point out like my favorite slogan or something like that. Um, but I do know that I do have my ideas about what's least effective. And this comes from a social movements scholarship research, which is like, if you want to alert the public to what you're concerned about, try not to piss them off first. And so that like 9/11 was an inside job, it's coming from a place of like, declaration, but if your point is to get people in, then you don't want to push them away. So the question then becomes what would get people to kind of you know, come to you, and maybe making a provocative claim does. I think that question is really great. And I think I want to ask a lot of the activists who regularly participate in street activism that particular question. So actually what you've done for me is now I'm really thinking like, yeah, what does work the best? But that's a question that I would ask the activists because they're the ones who regularly experience this. And I've interviewed plenty of these people. So I'm sorry I can't directly answer it, but I promise that in the future I will have an answer to that.
Thank you. Thank you very
Thank you very much.
Yeah. This was a wonderful meeting tonight. It's really good to meet you face to face. I hope we have a chance sometime to meet in person. And I just have to comment, I love your background, the eagle versus the dove. That is just spectacular. Thank you. And at this point, we're going to end the recording and go on to the second portion of our meeting, which is the agenda. We do not actually record that part. Thank you again, and I hope to have you back sometime.
Yes, and thank you very much for inviting me, and I appreciate all the feedback.